Hello and welcome to the Solomon Strategic Advisors podcast series. Today we have a special guest, Matthew Arbo, who this week in May 2026 released a new book, The Pursuit of Character, Recovering the Virtues. So welcome to the studio, Matt. So tell me, what has been the best part of your day so far?
Best part of the day was going on a jog this morning in perfect, unhumid, clear, bright weather. It was great. We've had 2 weeks of musty, awful rain, foggy rain, and it's just been miserable. So it all broke through today and the sun's out. It felt great.
It really makes a difference. So tell people, where are you based in America?
My family and I live in the DC area. We're actually in Arlington, just across the river from DC.
Amazing. Okay. And then for those that don't know who you are, tell me about you and then let's talk about your book.
Yes. I am a professor turned consultant turned policy expert on the Hill turned consultant again. um, and my career has a strange arc, but I'm an ethicist by training and have been in and out of the leadership coaching and leadership consulting space for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years now.
You've got the book, The Pursuit of Character. Why this? Why now?
Yeah, this book was initially prompted by conversations with students. They enjoyed hearing about the virtues. They didn't really know about them. They were unfamiliar with the vocabulary. And I felt, even at that time, that really a good book was needed for students. And the more I talked to students, though, the more I realized actually there's a kind of wider unfamiliarity just within American culture, American church culture in particular, with the virtues. And so I thought now's a good time to write a book that's accessible to a wide audience that clergy, lay people, and others would like to read, and just get the basic contours of what the cardinal theological virtues are
Yeah.
and see it something as less ideal. I think there's a way of portraying the virtues as though it's sort of only for the most exemplary and the most heroic. And I try to make those just more ordinary. So
Wow.
that's part of the reason why. And also, I just think that there's features of our social life that are really troubling and sclerotic. And I think the time for individual concentration on our ordinary practices, on our day to day lives, are really important. And those practices over time form us and shape us and give us the sort of attitudes that we take out into the world. So
Yeah.
it's a hope that in a direct way, maybe this is a slight indirect way, of ameliorating or improving or renewing social conditions in the long term. That's
Wow.
a hope. Yeah.
So that sounds like this really big hope. So let's dig in a little deeper. Do you believe that society is experiencing a kind of character crisis?
Yeah, I really do. I'm not sure I felt it was so acute maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, but I think there are enough features and we sort of hear enough from one another and read enough on our whatever our consumption sites are, that there are problems. There's a tremendous depth of loneliness and isolation. There is, their social discourse is very troubled and vexing. And I think more and more are just sort of checking out of that altogether. Like the conditions for social discourse, particularly on social media, just feels so tense that there's no way to kind of offer a generous or different sort of take. It just everything is sort of coded, as it were, or
Mm.
set up in partisan terms, and then just the tone of it is bad. So
Mm.
um, if we can't talk to one another, that points to something deeper at a cultural level, which is that we don't really maybe encounter each other in person enough. We don't spend enough time with people that we trust or people that are different from us.
Yeah.
These are all sort of parts of life that before social media were just part of normal, ordinary life. Like we just
Yeah.
did things together a whole lot more regularly. So it is, I think, at the edge of crisis. And something really needs to happen. I think there's beginning to see the swell of response to just how bad it really is.
Okay, so let's talk about the swell of response. And obviously, your book is coming at this time where it can give people an understanding of how they can respond themselves. So, what kind of a response do you see, and how does your book help kind of contribute to this hope that you have?
The first signs I saw and do see are people changing what sort of technology they carry around with them and what they do with technology. That's the first, I think, clear sign. I remember being in New York and seeing, kids to me in their early 20s carrying around digital cameras again, around their neck or
Wow.
DSLRs. And I remember doing that as a tourist way back until, phones were ubiquitous. And that's one feature of a move, the new markets for dumb phones are another example. But those are those are sort of artifacts of a change in attitude that was kind of unthinkable, really, even 5 or 6 years ago. There's an interest in analog in ways there hadn't been before. And I don't think that's just nostalgia. I think that's really born of an attitude of frustration with the sort of world we've inherited
Right.
and that's been given to us. And so those are ordinary practices like that takes some challenge. I mean, you have to really stick to it. That's a hard thing to do. Our life, social life is so framed by, technological access.
Yeah.
But beyond just those signs, there are others where people, I think, are returning to local communities very, very gradually. These even signs of increased church attendance in large urban areas, especially among young people. Increased civic participation, that's maybe less, a slight increase in volunteerism. Those are good signs. And it means that something about the last 10 years has really been difficult for people and they're just tired of it.
Yeah, that's amazing. So then your book is coming in at this point where people can grasp onto those core foundational virtues. So let's talk about the virtues themselves. And the first thing I want to ask is which was most difficult for you? You've mentioned the discipline that it takes to pursue life in a way that's more meaningful. So which virtue was most difficult for you to write about?
I should say, like before I say the answer specifically, I should say that writing a book about virtue makes you, as an author, aware of just how far you have to go.
There you go.
And I want to make it clear that I'm not any more virtuous than anyone else. That was a startling feature of writing this book, as you each chapter by chapter realize how deficient you are in some key ways that still so much to grow. And I think the virtue that was hardest to write about was temperance. And temperance is a inner capacity. It is an excellence of soul. That's what virtues are. It's
Mm,
an inner capacity to not act, to forego acting, or to resist impulse, inner impulse, and that's a really, really difficult virtue to exercise in a culture of immediacy like ours, where so much is available right now and gratification really can be instantaneous. So temperance was, I think, far and away the most difficult to write about.
So that makes me think about reducing character formation to self improvement.
Mhm.
And we're kind of habit tracking. So, how does your framework push back against that kind of approach that we're used to now?
In some ways, we're in a very interesting era of measurement and data, and we all have fitness trackers and apps and everything to optimize our life. And that can also be paralyzing. Just the sheer amount of information and what it will take for us to do something, or what it would take to insert a small bit of time to do something different than we have done. And just the challenge of disconnecting for a while, for
Yeah.
example. Those
Yeah.
are those are real. There's a way of talking about self-improvement that is constructive, and there are ways that are sort of more of a distraction. And in a lot of our discussions about leadership stuff, we use the word mindset a lot, and it's a good descriptive term. It talks about where we're at, what's our mental space like. But sometimes we could talk about it in ways that kind of don't really help in our kind of day to day life, like we could almost sort of enter our own middle world and flip a switch and our mindset's different. Like the furniture is rearranged and we're ready for something new. And that's just not how we're wired at all. And it takes a lot of time and effort. And we have to be committed to that rearrangement. It takes a lot. And so there's a way of thinking about optimization and self-improvement that see it on the one hand as either just impossible because where would we fit it in, and it's not measurable, right? And that's a interesting feature about virtue is we just never know um,
Yeah.
how much more virtuous we become in the course of a life. We find out in the very end. The
Wow.
whole of a life tells us about ourselves, and there's no way to measure this thing, and also it's not something that can happen quickly. So it means we're committed to practices that over time and in the aggregate with God's help, really do change who we are as a person. Our character and our souls are formed in the long term, and that means our attitudes and our inward dispositions are also formed as a consequence. So that question of how is it different from self improvement and kind of maximizing or optimizing yourself, it means actually instead of just relying only on yourself, it means relying on God and on others. It's
Mm.
realizing that we don't ourselves have all that we need to make ourselves be okay, and that is that sort of rubs against the grain of the sort of self improvement culture that's persisted the last few years.
Yeah, and that individualistic space that we seem to live in, because what you're saying is we need to lean on the collective experience to be
Yes,
able to pursue life in this virtuous
yes,
way. Wow.
yes. We need each other, right?
Yeah.
We need each other.
Yeah, I love that. So, in leadership development, I like looking at definitions of words and really thinking about by the definition what this means. So, let's talk about wisdom, because I've always experienced wisdom as an understanding put into practice. So, something you've gained along your experience that now you understand to an extent, you're able to contribute back in how
Hmm.
you're acting. So, how about we dust off the word wisdom and
Yeah.
you talk about it from your perspective of the book?
Yeah, that's a great working definition, what you just described.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's great, and it does. You do need, I think it is important to say what words mean, and I do that in each of the chapters because it turns out that over time the meaning of words does sort of gradually morph and
Yeah.
change.
Yeah.
It's what we call play. It's a part of a concept's meaning, and with wisdom, I think you're right to kind of mention there that there's sort of a quaintness to it, that it's sort of old or dusty.
Yeah.
And that's not the case. Everybody needs it and everybody relies on it every day. So your definition was great. In the book, I'd sort of describe it as an excellence of practical judgment.
Mm.
So it is active, means because we reach judgments on things and that usually terminates in some sort of action. We
Yeah.
decide to do something. A decision doesn't have to be active. We could hold on to that for a while, using other virtues and put off the action for another time. But it's fundamentally about practical judgment. And there's a reason why we tend to think of older people as more wise. And the reason is because they've had an eclectic range of experiences. And hopefully, those who are wise and we count as wise it's become part of their story, it's become part of their inner life. And so they have plenty of things to say about things that for us who are younger, we're caught flat footed and are completely novel. So I can ask my grandmother, who's in her mid 90s, about something that happened to her when she was my age, and learn something that I'd never thought I could learn.
Mm.
And that's true of all of us. Wisdom can be found in interesting places. It is not often found in the immediate or the sensational or the quick or the rapid. So hot takes are usually not very wise, for example. Old books that people have read for a long time tend to have quite a lot of wisdom in them, and that's why they keep getting read. That's
Mm.
why they become the repository of wisdom that they are, is because they carry it and they have it. So, but it is active, and that's an important feature of wisdom, that it is usually a judgment geared or aimed toward action.
Yeah. So then in leadership development, we talk a lot about how we're wired,
Mm,
and we're wired with a design and we kind of
yeah.
move in that way. Like you say, when we know certain things, we move a certain way. It equates to action. So then what's your take on the journey of wisdom impacting your design?
When we acquire wisdom, it becomes part of a universe or a little inner world of wisdom. So it's accrued.
Mm.
And what happens again over time is, we may make huge blunders and just ignore the wisdom that we've acquired. That happens, and that means we can grow from that. It's not a meaningless error, but it accrues. So that means that we can have a surplus, as it were, or we can have a reservoir to draw on. That in living of our life, there's judgments or there are features that of our experience that don't catch us completely by surprise.
Yeah.
Right. It may at one time have caught us by surprise, but now, and having acquired something like a body of wisdom, we're able to venture out in a way with more confidence. And that's actually in the Old Testament, wisdom is sort of treated as a teaching. That's just how it's described. It's a body, not just sort of a one little thing. We kind of think of a proverb as like a little slice of wisdom, and it is that. But it's only that if it belongs to a kind of larger set, right? A
Mm.
body of wisdom of which this is a part. And that's how those in the Old Testament speak of wisdom as though it's one little bit of it is part of a much, much bigger whole.
So in that sense, wisdom is transcendent of personality per
Yes.
se, and it lives like within you and part of your bigger, much bigger experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It surpasses us. It's long predated us and it will long outlive us. And that we'll only acquire some small part of it. Yeah.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay, so you write about both cardinal and theological virtues. So, for listeners who aren't familiar with the distinction, how do you explain the difference? And really, why does that matter for everyday life?
Yeah. The distinction isn't huge, but it's significant. The cardinal virtues, where we get that word cardinal, it's not like the bird, though that may be an easy way to remember
Yeah.
it. Cardinal comes from a Latin word which just means to hinge. So they're cardinal virtues in that they hinge on one another and all others hinge on these. So they're kind of like an irreducible four. Okay. And so prudence or wisdom, that's also another word for wisdom. That's one. Temperance is another. Fortitude or courage is another. And then fourth is justice. And I think of the four, justice is the one that many in the West are just unfamiliar with as a virtue, that it's an excellence of soul, because we tend to think of it as sort of a thing out there associated
Mhm.
with the law.
Yeah.
The theological virtues are faith, hope, and love, which are described in the New Testament in several different places as belonging together. So they also always go together. So faith, hope, and love are inseparable from one another in any meaningful sense. I treat them individually in the chapter, but also make clear that you can't really do that. Like faith and hope and love belong to one another in the same way that the cardinal virtues do. So, in other words, to have wisdom, as we've been talking about, means that you also just have to have a little bit of temperance and a little bit of courage and a little bit of
Mm.
justice. And the same goes for all the others, that there's some modicum there. And we may be stronger in one than the other at any one time for reasons we don't fully understand, but they at least involve those four. And there are heaps of other what we call secondary ancillary virtues, generosity and kindness and others that we can easily think of that are virtues, but they're not part of that cardinal four.
So then how do you see organizations or individuals using the content from your book, these teachings or understanding of the virtues?
The virtues are part actually of ancient Greek and Roman literature too. And Christianity doesn't have sort of the market cornered on the virtues. There have been other schools of thought which have considered that. And that's because it just is true that when we practice things, they are what the Greeks call habituated. And we understand how habits form us. There are all kinds of books about 21 days or however many days to good and bad habits. And we know that it's hard to get a good one in place and it's easy to get a bad one in place. So we get that. We understand that practice improves us. If we've played sports or engaged in any kind of activity or trained, we know that this is what it does to our body. In the same way, there are specific activities or disciplines, as I call them in the book, that put us in position to take on something new, to receive something new. And that's at least how Christianity has described it. You put yourself in a position through these disciplines to receive something new
Mm.
and to venture out again. Organizations, to your point, organizations actually can learn a tremendous amount, achieve a tremendous amount by knowing something about the virtues. It doesn't mean that an organization needs to go on this, dramatic quest to inculcate all of these virtues in the deepest possible way. But what it does suggest actually is that there isn't a way that your organization can grow healthy without the virtues. They are a precondition
Wow.
to strong communication, to enriched relationships of trust, to organizational growth that is really sustainable. There may be, growth that happens by happenstance, but only if there is that sort of base level of virtue. That is, you have something like a group of people who are in their own way, in own times, committed to the pursuit of those virtues, that you'll be able to sustain the kind of organizational life that you want to. If that isn't there, it won't work. Here's a kind of example of that at a much, much larger level, but it actually illustrates the point. When the early founders of the American Republic were thinking about charter documents and what kind of people this country was going to be, in the framing of those documents, there's lots of technicality and tediousness, but what they say in letters to each other and in speeches is that this whole republic idea, everything we're talking about, isn't possible unless the public itself has a sufficient level of virtue. That public virtue is something that the people care about. Otherwise, it will just all fall apart. You can't sustain a people that way. You need bonds of affection, like some sufficient bond of affection and trust. And that also applies. That's at a huge social level, but that also applies to individual organizations and communities.
I feel like you just blew my mind with that. I love that idea so much. So then how would you see organizations being able to implement these virtues maybe back into the organization? Perhaps they've gone away from this and they're experiencing some toxicity and the reality of people not living with those principles and values. So how might they re-implement it?
I don't want to overstate how much the organization has, particularly within the leadership of an organization, to encourage or prompt added practice from members of the organization. But what I think you can do is emphasize practices and approaches that do lead in the right direction,
Mm,
almost like nudges.
yeah,
And that's like telling people, hey, take time off.
yeah,
Use your PTO.
yeah.
Use that PTO. For some of us, that's not a problem, right? We'd like to have a little bit more. We'll go right to the last day. But for others, they'll need that nudging, and that's okay. That ends up being a good way of detaching from a specific thing. Usually, if you cannot give yourself PTO, it means you're overcommitted to the task, right?
Mm,
That you really do need some sort of modulation there. That's one example. An organization could just buy books for the team. I
yeah,
know of a book you could buy. I know of a book you could buy that would be perfect for this very thing.
yeah.
But yeah, exactly. But there are others too. You can invite speakers in for a morning to talk about something specifically related to personal growth. I don't want to overstate how much the organization can itself do. I think it's more about, from leadership, fostering a community of clear communication and trust, where the obvious encouragement is to yourself individually in your own capacity take those opportunities for implementing specific disciplines that really do lead somewhere, or specific practices that really do lead somewhere. And maybe the organization can figure out its own sort of incentives for that. But I think ultimately it really does have to be something that an individual wants. And that's a unique feature of virtue. You won't go after it unless you want to. That's just true of anything. We have to really want to do it. And if you feel compelled or coerced, it actually kind of feels like you want to sort of resist and bristle at that. So there's a careful way of doing this where it really does need to be in the individual's own capacity, their own decision that they want to take on their own initiative.
Yeah, and I think about how that individual contribution causes that ripple effect,
Yes.
and especially from the top, leaders defining culture. So when leaders can walk in that way and show what's important for the collective community, then it ripples out and people kind of take note
Yes.
without being forced or feeling coerced.
Yes. Yep.
Amazing.
That's right.
Okay, so you've talked about the religious community, so I'd like to focus there for a minute. What do you hope specifically that clergy and church leaders could take away from this book?
Yeah. The virtues have historically been a vocabulary within the Roman Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church. And Protestantism has had a sort of awkward inclusion of the virtues. It's for interesting historical reasons. I kind of touch on them here and there in the book, and I won't get into the into the weeds on that as much as my scholarly bookwormishness wants to. The virtues really are in accordance with everything we hear in the New Testament about the fruits of the Spirit and about what happens in sanctification. There's nothing at all discordant. In fact, they're perfectly coherent with that vision. In fact, what I would want to suggest is actually there's been a bit of a misconception within Protestantism about our own actions. And there's actually quite a bit of emphasis about good works in the New Testament. Those are not problems. They are the result of something else. I once heard, or maybe I think I heard, but maybe it was a reading of Dallas Willard say that grace isn't opposed to effort, it's opposed to earning. And that distinction, I think, is the sort of razor sharp one that would help Protestants, evangelicals understand this a bit better, which is actually by entering into specific disciplines, whether that's prayer or fasting or scripture reading or memorization or just attending church or whatever those are, they are either disciplines of engagement or renunciation, or trying to either not do something or to really do it. And those are shaping. In every instance, what we're actually also doing is in discipleship pursuing the fruits of the Spirit. That is, we're always receiving. So in every engagement or every act, we're also receiving, or every giving, we're also receiving. In every reception, we're somehow also giving. And as a community of faith, we really need to understand that virtues are not something sort of old or just sort of Catholic, but are actually germane to just the Christian tradition, which is to say that it is possible to acquire these excellences of soul.
So, on that note, who are the thinkers that most shaped your thinking in this book?
Oh, that's a great question. I would say mostly ancient, very, very old authors and some modern ones. So a few older voices would be Plato and Aristotle, and Augustine are key older ancient voices. And maybe for more modern voices would be a early 20th century figure, philosopher named Joseph Pieper, who most would have encountered with his book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture. That's what he's most famous for. But he also wrote some books on the virtue, which are just astonishing. They're wonderful books. And another one would be Oliver O'Donovan, who is a moral theologian in the UK. Those would be a few voices that I engage with quite a lot.
Oh, so then if a pastor wanted to preach a sermon or a series around the book, where would you tell them to start?
I think I would tell them to start with the theological virtues. I think it's worth saying again what faith is. I think it's worth saying it again and again and again, that it's belief, that it's confidence, that it involves trust, that it's also active in its own way, and that it's the beginning of things for the Christian. And that's both an evangelistic effort, but it's also one that has to endure. It isn't a moment of faith, it's a life of faith. We may have been able to point to some time when it seemed for the first time to take its root, but it's actually, if it is like a plant, then it goes through many seasons. And there are times in the course of a life when it feels quite weak and brittle. And there are times when it seems to be by the river, bearing forth fruit in its season, as the psalmist writes. Same for hope. Hope is not just sort of starry-eyed mysticism about, something that, I hope it happens, or sort of like projected wishes. Hope is something much deeper, and it just has to rest in something beyond this life. That's
Wow.
what hope points to. It points to, in an effective inward way, to the life that is to come, and knowing that this is not all there is, and that the gates of Christ's kingdom are not assailable. And that animates love in its own way too. And I think love needs to be clearly portrayed again. It's not just an impulse or affection. It's not Twitter passion. It's not just this little kind of cutesy thing that we admire. It's not an impulse of admiration. It is a commitment to serve and help another sacrificially, and minimally to affirm their existence and to offer them what they need, among other things. So I think if a clergy wants to start somewhere, let's just go back to the basics, and that can be rooted in our confession. It can be rooted in as many New Testament books as you want to. It's everywhere. If you want to start a sermon series, just start with Romans. It's a guaranteed winner, and they're all good. That would be my first encouragement, is to go back to basics.
So let's lean in on love a little more, because I think really every group of people, whether it's an organization or a church community, people
Mm.
feel funny about love.
Mm.
The way you just described it was entirely different. How does a CEO of an organization bring love into
Yes,
that space in their leadership?
yes. And there might be CEOs and leaders who just sort of cringe at the idea of incorporating love. And let me just say that that's not something to cringe over. You can't not do it. And if you profess to be Christian, that's just what you have to do. And you have to figure out how to do it, and exercise it seamlessly within the organization, maybe in a different way than you
Right.
do at home. Love is a commandment, right? That's how it appears in the New Testament. Love God and to love neighbor is the whole of the law, is what Jesus says. And so we know what the commandment is. The difficulty is how to go about that. Now, we might have an idea of how to love God. We love God when we worship Him, when we obey what He commands, and we follow Him in discipleship, and so on. Right? Worship is in a way, the most expressive form of action we have of love towards God, adoration, giving thanks, so on.
Yeah.
How to love others is a little more challenging, right? And that's what many, even the New Testament, ask. That's what the lawyer asked Jesus in the middle of Luke. He says, "Well, who is my neighbor?" Thinking he's going to catch Jesus up. And that's when Jesus tells the story over the Good Samaritan, which is fascinating for a number of reasons, not least that it's a Samaritan who is at the center of the story. And there are a number of takeaways, but one of them is that who our neighbor is might catch us by surprise.
Yeah.
And minimally, others make a claim on us. And it means requiring wisdom. We need to know what the person needs from us in the right time, in the right way. But it means minimally this capacity or openness to give, an openness to give and to see that the other is okay. Paul describes in Philippians each considering others better than themselves. So it means that it becomes like a whole reframing of our inner universe where we just want to put ourselves at others' disposal. And I'll admit I'm not there. I'm not there. you know, I look at sort of like Mother Teresa and others who have engaged in lives of extreme self-sacrifice, and I'm moved by that
Yeah.
because it struck them to the core and they couldn't see another way of living.
Right.
But we in our own ways can start our own efforts. And I think as the leaders of an organization, let's just start by saying that love is perfectly okay, right? Provided we don't just think of it as this sort of sentimental thing. It's not just romantic, right? I love my wife and I love my children and I love my church. And there's all kinds of ways we talk about our affections being ordered to that thing.
Mm.
That's why I think the ancient ways of saying love's plural. These are love's plural. We are ordering of our loves. We don't just have one. And I think there's lots of confusion today around just the basic concept of love and what it involves. And if we could just let go of the sentimentality and the sort of weird romanticism and instead just focus on the self-giving nature and the other related nature of love, then I think actually within our own families, in our communities, and within our organizations, we'll see a lot of dramatic change.
Yeah, I love that practical advice of take a step back, look at the spaces that you are in, the
Yes.
spaces that you hold influence, and ask yourself, how does love live here from me? How do I
Hmm.
love here? And get clear and okay with how you decide it lives there. And that might
Yes.
be a huge difference.
Yes. No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
I always love to ask authors in the writing process, what surprised you most? Was it a virtue that revealed something? Was it the process of getting from A to B to C and now you're launched?
I think it was saying just the right amount about the virtue without being indulgent and taking it too far and making it too tedious. Just trying to package it in a way that is completely understandable and so actionable. And I think if there's a sort of related difficulty, it was in providing illustrations or stories that make it thinkable for the person who's reading the book in a way that maybe it hadn't been before.
Yeah,
And what made that most difficult was not choosing heroic examples. I think that's especially true with like a virtue like courage or fortitude, where the examples that come to mind is someone, throwing themselves on the grenade to save their fellow soldiers and that kind of thing. And there are other ones that just strike us as sort of extreme valor. And it's a little bit trickier to just describe a story in which one is sort of ordinarily expressed in day to
mhm,
day life, but we actually do it all the time. And we're exercising these in very ordinary ways all the time. We have the conversation we've been putting off finally, right?
yeah,
We set our alarm and we get up as we intended to do,
mhm,
right? It isn't it isn't a huge achievement, okay? You might just say it's what you're supposed to do, but it is something. It's not nothing, right? We keep the phone plugged in the back because we realize that it's competing with those we love, and
oh,
so on and so forth. Right? We think of these more common things that they are important activities. So I think if there was a challenge, it was in just making the virtues accessible in a way that they're immediately understandable and also something that you want to take forward in your own action. And
So there are multiple examples of the tiny ways that you can express and live in those virtues every day in your daily operations. You
Yes.
don't have to go and, rescue a kitty from a tree,
Yeah,
uh,
that's right.
or whatever it
That's
is.
right. That's
That's
right.
fantastic. Okay, so then in closing, we have this world obsessed with the perception of achievement. So what would it look like for people to pursue character again? Vision with me.
Yeah. Here's the hard part for the big achievers. It means that you're becoming a person who doesn't really care about achievement. You're not even thinking about it. You just find that it's not really part of what motivates you anymore. What motivates you is seeing that others do okay. Like a little bit what I was talking about with Paul and Philippians, each be pulling for others to do better than you do. I'm just not there. You know, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. I'm often too envious and jealous to rejoice with people who rejoice, right? Thinking it should be me or that they don't really deserve it or whatever our, weird pathological thing is. But I think in that sort of high culture achievement, and that can certainly be part of organizations. Over time, it's realizing that actually the motivation isn't the achievement, though there is a sweetness to that. All right.
Yeah.
There's a sweetness to completing a task, and that's fine. But as a kind of aspiration for life, as a life goal, that's something else entirely. And I think what we'll find is that our life will have achieved something when achievement isn't part of the fundamental motivations for how our lives go.
It's so funny to think about that because how difficult it is to let go of that
Yeah.
idea of achievement, and how will you know when you've truly
Yes.
gotten rid of it?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And that too is an act of faith of, trusting that the one who began the work will finish it.
Wow. Amazing. Do you have anything that you would like to leave listeners with before we close out this episode?
1, buy the book. I'd like you to do that. I have to get past the weird irony of self-promoting a book on, the virtues. It's just I have to do it.
Yep.
I have good reasons. So buy the book. And also, I think I just repeat something I said earlier, which is that it's not impossible and
Mm.
it's not just idealistic. These are qualities that can really come to typify us as a person, and it'll make all the difference for those that we really care most about, and of course, to the kingdom.
Thank you so much for your time today. I'm personally very excited about this
Oh,
book
great.
and what it will do for humanity. So it'd be nice to catch back up with you in some time and see how things are going as well.
Okay, I'd love that.
Thanks again.